I can share this with others later. Thank you, Wendy. And welcome to those of you that will be viewing this later. I'm holding this space for you to be here now with us. And thank you to everybody that made time to be here. I know that we can do so many different things with our time, and I appreciate you choosing to spend this time with me. Hi, Priscilla from California. Hi, Wendy from Maryland. You're welcome. Glad to have you. So I'd just like to invite you into this space. So if you'd like to take a moment just to settle, maybe place a hand on your heart, close your eyes if that feels safe and comfortable to you. Just take a deep breath, allowing yourself to come into your body. And I'd like to invite you to just acknowledge what you'd like to receive today from this time. It's my intention to be fully present with you and to convey this information and knowledge in a loving way. Just take another deep breath. Okay. And there was something else I wanted to say. I can't remember. Hi, sunshine. Glad to be here. Glad you're here. No worries that you have to leave. So I just encourage you to take what resonates and leave the rest. Feel free to ask me questions as we're going along. I'm not super awesome about the chat, but I'll try to keep up with it. You can also raise your hand. There'll be time at the end for questions and answers and shares, which I invite you to share anything about your grief journey if you feel safe and comfortable doing that. I will stop the recording at that point, so nobody else will witness it except the people that are on the call. I wanted to start the information with a quote from Leo Tolstoy. Hi, Becca. And he says, "Only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow. But this same necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and heals them." I trained to volunteer in hospice many years ago. I actually went through the training twice in my life over the course of 20 years. And something that really stood out to me about the last time I did the training was morning cup. Hi, Laura. A morning cuff, not a cup. And that was something that we used to wear on our arms to symbolize that we were grieving. It was a black band. And I always thought, I wish we still could do that or did that in society today. Thanks, Jules. It's called a rainbow maker. It's a quartz on a little solar plant panel that spins in the sun. It is one of my favorite things. It makes me very happy. So I always, it felt to me like that's something we should still do, because it gives you permission to grieve. It gives you permission to grieve out loud. And it shows people out when you're in society that you are grieving, and maybe they can be a little bit more gentle with you. I did a little bit of research on the black band or the morning cuff, and it was mostly used during the Victorian period. One of the first visuals of a black mourning band was documented in 1614 in a portrait of the Queen of Bohemia. And it's also speculated that Queen Elizabeth Stuart wore the mourning armband in honor of her deceased brother, the Prince of Wales, Henry Frederick. Beyond the Victorian period, the practice of wearing a black armband to show that the wearer was in mourning grew in popularity in the United States. And I didn't dig too deep, but the only information I could really find is that we stopped that custom somewhere after World War I. So if anybody on the call knows anything about mourning cuffs and wants to share more, please do. I would love to hear it. It was something we used too in the place of mourning clothing, because that was a popular practice too, was that you'd wear certain clothes when you were in mourning. But for people that didn't have the resources to buy those clothes, that's another reason why the cuffs started to take or gain popularity. And we still wear them in sports and military. So you might see it there. Oh, nice, Jules. Thank you for sharing that you remember that from late 50s. Yeah, somewhere around the world wars. Yeah. So we just don't see them in everyday life, at least here in the States, we don't. Let's start bringing it back. So recently I heard John Edwards speak, and some of you might be familiar with him. He's a medium. And he was talking about how grief blocks us from connecting with those on the other side. And he said every single one of us has that ability. Every single one of us have psychic abilities and are intuitive and can get in touch with our loved ones if we want to. And when the interviewer asked him why most of us don't or can't, he said it was grief, that grief blocks us. And that we will sometimes expect the loved ones on the other side to put on this like Broadway show for us, to show us that they're present and they're trying to give us messages, when it's usually much more subtle. You know, it's a song on the radio, or you're watching a movie and that one line of the movie really stands out like it never has before. So he said that grief is the persevering of love, and grief is the other side of love. And it's the way of feeling our feelings of love, but not knowing where to place it or put it. I just thought that was such a beautiful way to articulate grief. And it makes it seem less scary and less heavy, I think. I'm, of course, not actively grieving anything right now, so it's probably easy for me to say that. But in times of grief, I have felt a certain element of beauty to it. And I hope to convey that today for you. Let's see. Laura said her grief did hold her wide open for 10 years and had many messages through dreams. Yeah. And quiet time when you were grieving your husband. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I did a lot of dream work with a particular situation in my life around grief, and I found it to be incredibly healing. It was really amazing. So the other thing that John Edwards said about having, the other side of grief being love, is that we have a key without the lock. So we have the love, but nowhere to put it when the person or the situation is gone. We recognize that we still have the key, and we don't need the physical lock because we still have the key, we still have the love. And the key represents symbolically what it would open up anywhere. So thought form of the lock is equally as powerful as the physical form if we allow ourselves to connect with that. So just wanted to share that because I thought it was really interesting. The universe works in such beautiful ways. I heard that just a few days ago as I was planning this gathering. So I thought it was important to share. So moving on to the defining grief. I'm going to share a few different definitions, and I want you to, again, take what works for you and leave the rest, or take none of it, or maybe combine them all. So the average person, as we know, tends to associate real grief as only related to death. But in fact, grief is the natural and normal emotion that people experience with every major change experienced in life. And hi, Paul, I see that you have your hand raised. I'll get to you in just one moment. So the definitions I wanted to share with you come from the grief recovery method. And these include, the first one is grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. The second definition that they share is grief is the feeling of reaching out for someone who's always been there, only to discover that when you need them one more time, they're no longer there. The third definition is that grief is the feeling of reaching out for someone who has never been there, only to discover that when you need them one more time, they still aren't there. The last definition that they shared is that grief is the feeling of reaching out for someone who had been, my heat is on and blowing my hair everywhere. Grief is the feeling of reaching out for someone who had been there at one time, only to discover that you can't go to them for help or comfort anymore. So I thought all of those were pretty poignant. Let me see, Paul. If you have a specific question, Paul, do you mind putting it in the chat? And then we'll do raised hands toward the end of the call after the journey, if you're okay with that. Okay. So most of us have very little formal education on how to handle grief. And most of what we learned as children was gathered from watching the adults in our life and how they tried to deal with their pain of emotional loss. Since they probably had no formal education concerning how to deal with grief, they were struggling as well. Let me see, Paul, if you had a question here. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Paul. I just can't multitask that well, I'll be honest. So the adults in our life were struggling to deal with grief because they probably weren't taught about grief either. So in many cases, people might try to cope with that pain by burying it in their heart and never talking about it. That doesn't make the pain go away, as we all know. It just takes away from the ability to truly feel happy or content. So typical responses that are associated with grief are reduced concentration, a sense of numbness, disrupted sleeping patterns, changed eating habits, a roller coaster of emotional energy. And I often, and I'm sure many of you have heard this before, it's kind of like the ocean, right? Grief is sometimes at high tide where it just overtakes you and you feel like you can't come up for air. Sometimes it's low tide and it feels like, oh, okay, I feel okay right now. And then something comes along and reminds you of whatever it is, and it's high tide all over again. And it's just up and down and up and down. It's a roller coaster. There are over 43 losses that are considered grief. Some examples include death, divorce, retirement, moving, pet loss, financial change, whether that's an increase or a decrease in wealth, loss of health, legal problems, an empty nest, end of an addiction, starting school. Some intangible examples of grief are loss of trust, loss of safety, loss of control, loss of faith, and loss of fertility. So grief is individual and unique. There's no one right way to do it or wrong way to do it. There are no absolutes in grief. There are no reactions so universal that all or even most people will experience them. Grief is normal and natural. It's not a pathological condition or a personality disorder. It can be mislabeled or mislabeled, I'll say. Sometimes, especially undigested grief, if it's been years and years since something happened and it's just grief that hasn't been acknowledged, it can be labeled as ADHD or depression or PTSD and so many other things. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not trying to say one is, that if you are depressed, you don't have grief, or if you have grief, you don't have depression, or you do have one and don't have the other. It's just that sometimes that undigested, unprocessed, unrealized grief can cause a lot of the same similar symptoms. So how do you know if you or someone else you know is incomplete with a loss? There are a few ways. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but one of them is if you're unwilling to think about or talk about somebody who has died or express feelings about any other losses. There might be some unresolved grief, unfinished grief. Another is if fond memories turn painful, you might be experiencing undigested or unresolved grief. Another indication is if you want to talk only about the positive aspects of the relationship, you might be incomplete. Wanting to talk only about the negative aspects of the relationship. Undigested grief may be at the root of any fear associated with thoughts or feelings about a relationship. And those are just a few examples of unresolved or undigested, unprocessed grief. And it's everywhere, undigested grief. An incomplete past might create a grim future. Many people alter their life choices after a series of unresolved losses. And this is done to protect themselves, or we do it to protect ourselves from further heartbreak, which is a very natural reaction. Usually this just translates to living a guarded life and reluctance to participate fully in relationships or new endeavors. So that fear can keep us from moving forward and trying new things and meeting new people, starting new relationships. Undigested grief due to prior losses in someone's life can resemble depression. As I said earlier, they can have very similar symptoms. We've mentioned these: difficulty concentrating, the roller coaster of emotions, sense of numbness, disrupted sleeping patterns. It's a big one for me. Altered eating habits and massive loss of energy. It can also result in undigested or unresolved grief can also result in what are called short-term energy relieving behaviors in an attempt to cover the feelings caused by the unresolved grief. And as you can imagine, there are many, but some include alcohol, food, shopping, exercise, maybe even gambling, any of those types of distractions, which for me, I know oversleeping is one for me, and sugar in the form of food. I love sugar when I'm not feeling great. So moving on to types of grief. The first one I wanted to address, there are many, many, many types, but the first one I wanted to address was chronic and prolonged grief, or is chronic and prolonged grief. And as you can guess, that lasts over an extended period of time. And it's when people continue to suffer through their grieving experience for years without ever effectively moving through the grieving process. For some, it's related to a single heavily impacting loss. And this may be the death of an important figure in their lives. For others, it might be due to the loss of everything familiar, due to a disaster or a fire or a war. There was a counselor in the 1960s. His name, I'm probably not going to say correctly, but I'm going to try. Simon Olshansky. I think it's Olshansky. He worked with parents of developmentally disabled children, and he coined the term chronic sorrow. And that was used to describe the extended and ongoing grief that those parents experienced. In that situation, for some parents, the grief can continue because their original dreams of the quote unquote perfect child were dashed by the reality of the ongoing issues that they faced. So, this isn't meant to say that those parents can't have or couldn't have a wonderfully fulfilling relationship with their child, but rather to recognize that it's not the relationship that they had originally planned or expected. And it's totally normal to grieve that. Whatever the cause is, the net effect is that people that identify with these issues of grief tend to suffer them over an extended period of time. In some cases, left without treatment, they may suffer emotional pain for the rest of their lives. And just because a person continues to feel that pain doesn't mean that they must suffer forever. As with any form of grief, the key to moving beyond that emotional pain is the willingness of the griever to accept that they are grieving and that they're grieving a loss and that they have a desire to take some action or to recover from the grief. And taking action doesn't mean that they're trying to discount the impact of the loss. For those dealing with a death, it means that they see the need to deal with the pain so that they can once again enjoy fond memories of the relationship. For those dealing with the loss of all things familiar, it's the recognition that they do not wish to continue letting a single disastrous event have power over their lives. In the situation of those parents who have a developmentally disabled child, it's about dealing with the loss of a dream so that they may better face and emotionally invest in the ongoing commitment to being the best advocate and parent for that child. Far better approach to moving beyond the power of this emotional pain is to follow an action plan focused on dealing with the unmet dreams and expectation of a future that is different than had been expected. It's about addressing those things that grievers had wished had been different or better in that relationship lost. It offers an effective way to say goodbye to that which has been lost, to make it possible to face the future with a new perspective. So, the second type of grief I wanted to talk about is delayed grief, and that is postponed grief that resurfaces sometime later. It's not that unusual after a loss that there are many things that must be done. Often people decide that they must be strong for those around them and suppress their own feelings of pain and loss so that they can be there for others. Some people feel that the best way to handle their personal loss is to keep busy with work or other endeavors rather than taking the time to go through the grief process. Very normal for a lot of us. The situation with grief is that if you fail to take action to deal with your personal emotional pain and instead suppress it, it stays buried and will burden you later. Mark Liebenow, I think I'm saying that correct. Let me check the chat here. Oh, Laura, thank you for sharing. She said that she suppressed grief for 3 years and then it hit harder the next time it came around, which is, yeah, thank you for sharing. Mark Liebenow used this quote in an article in the Good Men Project. And this is what he said. Ignoring grief is like a leak in our roof. We can take care of it now, or we can wait as it seeps through the ceiling, gets into the walls, and warps the floors. So, this truly describes what it is like if we fail to address the grief that touches our lives. When we suppress it, it seeps ambiguous grief. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Share. Share. When we suppress it, it seeps into other parts of our well being, and it can inadvertently impact other relationships and keep us from fully enjoying them. Those suppressed feelings can also negatively impact our health, resulting in so many things, but from headaches to ulcers are pretty common ones. Our socialization process has ingrained into us that the idea we should ignore or hide our emotional feelings of pain. It's ingrained in the idea that we should hide our emotional pain and sad feelings and put on a happy face. When we avoid dealing with grief, it'll wait for another moment to surface. We've had situations where something we see or hear triggers a memory from the past. Let's see. Delayed grief, yeah. 4 years ago. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, Paul is saying he had delayed grief that came back or resurfaced about 40 years later. Yeah, and sometimes you can feel like you thought you dealt with it, and then boom, there it is again. And that's okay. You know, it's a good teacher. It has something else to teach us. Um, but yeah, when we bury something, we might hear or see something that triggers a memory from the past. And as an example, let's say you see a garden and it reminds you of the flowers that your mother used to plant. And it's a fond memory until you start thinking about all the other moments in your relationship with your mother that you wish you had addressed. It might be things you wish things that would have been different or better. Or sometimes it's those memories of conversations that you wish you would have finished or that weren't finished. And for some, it can be about the dreams and expectations for a future that was different because of her death or your estrangement from her. You may find that suddenly and unexpectedly, all those happy feelings that were generated by seeing the garden have led you to a place of sadness. All of these things relate to the suppressed grief issues that you have delayed addressing. And if you discover that you have delayed grief issues in your life, you can take action to deal with them if you choose to. The other option is just to continue to suppress them and have those issues trouble you. And I'm not saying that that's an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. It's just when you've finally made the decision to address the um, delayed grief or suppressed grief or ambiguous grief, it changes your life, usually for the better. Going through the pain isn't awesome, but the other side is generally a whole lot clearer and a whole lot better. So the last form of grief I wanted to speak to today is cumulative grief. And I think most humans have some cumulative grief. And to say that grief can be challenging and overwhelming it's an understatement. It's not unusual for a griever to feel like their whole world is closing in on them. It's common to find that you're not only dealing with the emotional pain of your most recent loss, but every other loss you've experienced as well. It can be as if this latest event has awakened your memories of every other life-changing moment. Check the chat here. Is that the same as complicated grief? Yeah, I would say so. Complicated, cumulative. Yeah, it's a good question. So when cumulative grief starts to become present or is more in our awareness, you're welcome, Jules. It's awakened the memories of every other life-changing moment that has brought your life into grief or has brought you into grief as well. The reason for this is that grief is cumulative. So most of us have a defense mechanism or habit in place that suppresses our painful emotions rather than expressing them. And this is a habit that we begin to establish at a very early age because we'll hear somebody tell us not to feel bad or don't feel sad when we're having a sad moment. And while that comment doesn't make us feel any better, we tend to bury those feelings of sadness in an effort to follow the directions offered by someone we trust on how to cope with an emotionally painful event. Until each loss is effectively addressed, they tend to sit, waiting inside of us. When yet another moment of grief hits us, and that internal kettle, where we have stored all of this sadness, is full, it tends to erupt like a volcano. We can find ourselves then not only grieving this most recent loss, but all those other past losses as well. Just as with the falling ash of a volcanic eruption, it seems that no matter which way we turn, we are surrounded by the painful memories of past bereavement. Perhaps yet another analogy that can help you visualize what's happening inside of you is to think of a drawer or a cupboard or a closet where you store all of the scattered items that you think you might need someday, but don't know what to do with them in the meantime. When you open that container, it's often difficult to find anything amid all of the clutter. I have that drawer in my kitchen. It can be overwhelming. And this is very much like our personal internal storage center for those grief-filled memories of our life. It's such a random collection of memories of sad moments from our life that it's difficult to isolate each individual thought. Dealing with all of these memories of loss may seem like an impossibility. That's because we've been taught our entire lives to suppress our feelings of loss rather than deal with them. They can't be dealt with all at once. We'd fall on the floor in a puddle. It's a bit like the old question, how do you eat an elephant? The answer is this, one bite at a time, which I don't know why anybody want to eat an elephant, but that's how you can effectively deal with as many losses as you might have as just one at a time. And to do this, you can consider taking an inventory of your past grieving events and deciding which to first address. Sometimes it's best to place, or the best place to start with this is the most recent loss. But some people can find that the most recent emotional event is kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and it's just too much to look at. So a previous loss might be better to look at then in that case. Whichever is the case for you, it gives you a starting point. You can't effectively deal with every grieving event at the same time. To have the best chance of success, you must work on each individual one. It would be wonderful if you could deal with every loss in your life at once, wouldn't it? If we could just magically be done, but it just doesn't work. And multitasking in this situation will only leave you confused and unsettled regarding all of them. So, as the quote goes, the longest journey begins with the first step. So, maybe just making the decision is the step. So, moving on to myths, common myths. Let me check the chat here. Do you think that that's where shock comes in and our bodies eventually release these emotions a bit at a time? Yeah, I would say so, Laura. I think Laura asked if that's where shock comes in and our bodies eventually release the emotions a bit at a time. I think, it's so different for everybody. It's such an individual process. But I think that when you intentionally move your body in honor of grief, that can help a lot with releasing what's stuck anywhere. And I think our bodies are so intelligent that we do release it a bit at a time, and we release it in amounts we can handle. I don't know if that helps. If that's like that's not what I was asking, please um, um, put your question in the chat again so I can be better about that. Okay, you're welcome. All right, so common myths. The first one I wanted to talk about is time heals. We all have heard the time heals all wounds, and time does not heal. Action within time heals. So there are people who have waited 10, 20, 30, even 40 years to feel better. And time only passes. It really doesn't do anything. It's what we do within that time that affects the quality of our lives. So the false idea that time heals emotional wounds is based in a misunderstanding of the normal human reaction to losses of all kinds. For example, um, in our immediate reaction to the death of somebody we love, it's really normal and natural at first to feel numb, just have that sense of numbness. And the numbness lasts differing amounts of times for each person. It's usually accompanied by an inability to concentrate or focus, which tends to last longer than the numbness. It makes sense that we have a hard time paying attention to routine day-to-day activities or things in the immediate aftermath of a death of someone that we love. And here's where the myth of time healing gets its false foothold. As we adapt to the new and usually painful reality of the death, we begin to be able to function a little better. With that comes the illusion that time has healed us. But all that's really happened is that we're adapting to the physical absence of the other person. Adapting to the loss doesn't mean that we're emotionally complete with all the things we wish had been different, better, or more, or with the unrealized hopes, dreams, and expectations we had for our future with that person. Yeah, thank you. Laura is saying it never goes away, but we integrate it over time as part of our lives, never forgetting, just remembering, embracing what we had and rebuilding the new us. That is so beautifully said. Thank you for sharing that. It's really gorgeous. So we've all known people who have adapted to the reality of loss, but are still carrying a mountain of unfinished business about a death or a divorce or any other losses for many years. If time were a healer, that would not be the case. The key to recovery from grief is action, not time. The best example, or a good example, of supporting this idea is that action is a key, is the idea of a flat tire. So let's say you walk out to your car and you see that one of your tires is flat. You're not just going to sit there with the tire and wait for it to inflate over time. That wouldn't happen. So you know that you either have to change the tire yourself or call the auto club or whoever it might be to change the tire for you and get you back on the road. And it's the same with an emotionally broken heart. It's remarkably like a flat tire. The get up and go has just got up and gone. There really isn't any get up and go. And the ability to participate fully in life is limited if it's there at all. And again, action is key. You have to take actions and steps to complete what was left unfinished for you by the death, the divorce, or the other loss. Or you may find yourself just wandering through life without purpose or focus, trapped under the weight of the unfinished baggage that you're dragging with you. Let's see, Jules, do you think the world is experiencing collective grief? Absolutely. Yep. I do think there's a lot of collective grief going on, and that's another reason why I wanted to create this space today. Um, there's so much contributing to that grief, and from the loss of our personal freedoms and liberty, in some ways, sure, yeah, absolutely. Even though it's for our health and our safety, and no, there's so much we could go into there, but yeah, I believe in past lives, and I believe that we have probably all endured a pandemic of some sort, and we've watched people that we love die in a pandemic. We ourselves may have died, and so there's grief in our DNA from that too. I know that's completely different than what you're asking, but um, yes, I think we are having a lot of collective grief right now. And it's a good question. Thank you for asking. So the second myth is to grieve alone. Often this advice is subtly implied. So you'll hear things like give your mom space, or he just needs a few minutes alone in his room. As children, we learned that what this means is that sad feelings should be hidden or experienced alone. And that's not a natural tendency, it's a learned behavior. If you consider this phrase, which most of you automatically know, I'm going to leave out the last word and I want you to just come up with it. Laugh and the whole world laughs with you. Cry and you cry alone, right? Your mind likely jumped right ahead to that word. And if you consider what the first thing that you want to do when you have something to celebrate or you have good news, you probably want to share it with people that you care about, your best friend, your partner, your spouse, your kids. And whether you realize it or not, your natural impulse upon getting sad news or bad news is actually the same. You want to tell somebody you trust. But after a lifetime of being told that laugh and the world laughs with you and you cry alone, or a lot of us probably heard as kids, if you're going to cry, go to your room, or don't burden others with your feelings, you begin to lose the normal impulse to talk about sad or painful things with people you trust. It's helpful for you to start to shift what you believe about communicating your sad and painful thoughts and feelings in the same way you do your happy or positive ones. The antidote to isolation is participation. And even if that means participating online. Let me check the chat here. Yeah. Yeah, Paul is saying he still deals with a life of trauma and chaos from medical work and personal, and they research things that he's dealt with resurface reverently. You're welcome, Elizabeth. I'm glad to create change. And Laura's saying it's true, we do cry alone because society as a whole cannot deal with grief. It's absolutely so true. That's why I want to bring the Black bands back. It's back to work within a week, right? Bereavement is a week or two, and then you're supposed to be done. Like, oh, that's in a box. Don't open it anymore. And yeah, you're so strong, you can handle it. And that's what you heard when people walked away from you. Oh, so sorry. So if this feels right for you, you can start by having a little chat with a few of the important people in your life. Tell them that you'd like to make it safe to talk openly about some of the sad or painful things that you feel. And what you say should just be simple statements or comments, things that have affected you. Keep it short just to get it out and be heard. Let's see. Oh, you're welcome, Misty. Thanks for coming. And as a listener, just make the agreement not to analyze or judge. Just listen. And this isn't suggesting that you recite a litany of painful feelings over and over. If you have recurring feelings about the same things, you may need to get some help, either in the area of grief recovery or other professional help. Let's see what Jules is saying. In Australia and New Zealand, there is a Thursdays in Black movement to mourn and bring light to sexual violence. That's awesome. Great. We need more of that. It's good to know. Thanks for sharing. So the last myth is be strong, right? So usually the griever is asked to be strong for others. You have to be strong for your wife, or you have to be strong for your children. It may become clear to you that the attempt to be strong, rather than being honest, also keeps us from taking actions or steps that lead to recovery. So many of us carry with us the incorrect idea that we need to be strong in response to emotionally affecting events. There's a kind of logic in that idea, because when there's been a death, we're often called upon to make notifications to other loved ones, maybe to take care of the details of the memorial or the funeral. And then you have to deal with all the other logistical, practical considerations that accrue when somebody dies. And the problem lies in confusing the need to have whatever energy and focus are demanded for those tasks and the false idea of pushing away and covering up the naturally occurring emotions connected to the death of somebody we love. In attempting to be strong or be strong for others, we might hide our own feelings, at least those that might be visible, as in tears or other natural verbal and nonverbal displays of emotion. When we act strong, well, you're welcome, Paul. Absolutely, you do what you have to do. Thank you for coming. When we act strong and cover up our honest emotions, we are lying to those we interact with. Not to mention, we may be lying to ourselves. If we're not supposed to feel bad or sad when something painful comes to us, then it follows that we will have to pretend to feel good and strong when we don't. Let's see. What if your empathy blanket is fragile and can barely hold itself, almost like the last straw, because others kept adding theirs without acknowledgement? It's a really good question. Ibtisam is asking, if people are around you are adding to your feelings, and that feels like the last straw because you're having a hard time holding yourself in grief and in love and in pain. That's a really good question. I'm not sure how to answer that at this very moment in time. I'm going to think about that. Thank you for asking. Jules asked or said we can be humiliated for expressions of grief, such as "don't be silly when we cry." Yeah, I heard that a lot when I was a kid. That's tough. That's a tough one. Laura was saying that her daughters were teenagers and the schools didn't think it was okay for her to cry in front of them. Oh, that shut them down for several years and created other scary happenings, such as suicidal thoughts, for one, and seeking out comfort in the arms of others who were abusive and controlling. Yeah. Oh, Laura, I'm so sorry. Yeah, that is horrendous. Oh, man. Well, just to finish up this myth, because I want to take you on a journey and I'm almost at an hour already. So I want to honor your time. And if you need to leave, please do. The journey will be in the recording. No, Becca, it's, I know you're not seeing them all. Some people have their settings on the chat going only to panelists, which is just me. And then some other people have it as panelists and attendees. So you'll see those, but you won't see the others. So that's why that happens. So let's see. Oh, you're welcome. Regarding the previous. Yes, we will do the journey now. Ibtisam. Yeah, Jules, that could be a boundary issue. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good thought. Think about that. Basically, just, to cover up our feelings is lying to ourselves and to others. And that gets exhausting, and grief is exhausting. So, oh, okay, Jules had a similar experience recently. Excellent. Well, not excellent, but thank you for sharing. A quote that came up was, "You can be strong or you can be human. Pick one." So for the journey, I am going to share an image, but I also want to share a drum track. That's a shamanic drum track. And you can grab that from the chat if you want to. And then otherwise, I'm going to have it quiet for everybody else who doesn't want the drum track. So I'll try to, man, I only have 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to share an image. So just get comfortable and allow yourself to settle in. I'll keep this at about 7 minutes or so. So just bring your awareness to your breath and allow yourself to follow your breath. And visualize a beautiful place in nature. This can be somewhere you've been before or a new place that comes up in your mind's eye. And just sense this place with all of your 5 known senses. See it. What do you feel with your hands, with your feet? What do you smell? Maybe there's a taste of something in the air. And into this beautiful place, invite a guide. Call on a guide to come to you. It can be an animal, an ancestor. And don't question what you're receiving. This guide wants to be with you in this moment. Maybe you welcome your guide with a hug and a thank you. And you and your guide, or guides if more than one showed up, begin to look for a way to get underground. Maybe it's a hole, maybe a tree, maybe it's a body of water. Begin to go down this hole with your guide and feel the embrace of Mother Earth. You're traveling through a tunnel to get underground, and you come into an open space. You see a pathway before you. Follow this pathway. And you'll come to a place where perhaps you'll see your grief. Open to what shows up and trust that it's what's meant to be. And ask your grief, what are you here to teach me? How can I use you as medicine to help in my life right now? Or maybe you want to ask, why are you showing up this way? Take a few moments now to ask your grief whatever you want, or continue to receive information from the other questions. Maybe your grief wants to shift or change. And now it's time to go back. Thank your grief. Walk away down the path with your guide. Back up through your tunnel, out through your tree or hole or water, back to your place in nature. Saying goodbye to your guide, sit on the earth in your place. Taking a moment to integrate. And take a deep breath, inviting some gentle movement into your body. Perhaps wiggling your fingers or your toes. And come back into your space now, your physical space, your room. Taking one more deep breath. I'm going to give you a few moments to journal if anything came through, just to come back into your space. Just a couple more moments here. And for anybody that needs to leave, I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so that we can have some shares if you'd like to share. And for those of you that are parting, thank you. I hope you learned something that helps your heart. And I'll see you soon.